here at Hope City. Now, if you've been around Hope City for a while, you'll know our normal pattern is to work bit by bit through the Bible. And this year we've been looking at Matthew's Gospel. That's Matthew's telling of the life story of Jesus. And one of the things I really love about this way of doing things is that we don't get to set the agenda. We don't choose and pick the topics that we would like to cover, but instead God gets to set the agenda as we follow through the story piece after piece. We don't get to choose what we cover. We don't get to choose what we avoid either. Now today we come to a section addressing a topic that frankly I really wouldn't have chosen to speak on if I was setting things, but Jesus does have something to say to us, so we're going to try and listen carefully to him together this morning. And it's a bit of a serious and a sensitive topic, so it might stir things up a little bit for you, and if it does, I'm sorry, but this is where Jesus is taking us. We're going to take a little bit more time as well, and I have warned our children's program in advance that that's going to happen, so they're not horribly surprised. But it just is going to take us a little bit more time to do this well. But we do believe that God is good all the time, and so we think even when things are difficult, and he takes us into difficult places, he does that for our good. I should also say, after the gathering, we're going to have a prayer team available at the back. If it would help you to pray with someone, to have someone pray for you, you can speak to them in confidence. We're also going to do our normal stuff of taking questions, and I expect there'll be questions this morning. It's a hot potato topic. Please just be thoughtful as you're asking questions about the words you use, and we know that our words can hurt other people. So do ask questions, but please try and ask questions gently, and we'll respond later. Obviously, it won't be a prepared response. We won't necessarily get it all right. It'll be far from perfect. And if you want more follow-up afterwards, please do just come and talk to me or any of the other leaders here. Or if you're online, drop me an email. I'm Matt, M-A-T-T, at hopecityedinburgh.org. Okay, we're going to get straight to it, and Alex is going to read for us today from Matthew chapter 19, which is page 986 in those blue Bibles. Chapter 19, 986. Look for the big 19. I can. It is.
No? Yeah, there we go. That's calm. Matthew 19, page 986. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate.' Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it is not that way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery." The disciples said to him, "If this is the situation between a man and a wife, it is better not to marry." Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." Then people brought little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples rebuked them. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." When he had placed his hands on them, he went on from there.
Thanks very much, Alex. Now, our narrator tells us that these Pharisees, kind of religious leaders in the ancient Jewish world, they've come to test Jesus. And that immediately makes me wonder, well, why is this particular question they're asking a test? What is it about this question that makes it a test? How is a question on divorce policy a test for Jesus? Well, back in those days, there was a lively debate around divorce, even in the Jewish community, who in theory should be singing off of the same hymn sheet, the law of Moses being their kind of dominant text that describes how they should live. But there were two divergent Jewish views around divorce on the time. On one hand, you had the Shammai and his people telling you that divorce was only for a few exceptional circumstances. And on the other hand, you had Hillel and his people saying, well, you can divorce for basically anything. A wife burns the food, she's gone. Find somebody else more attractive. Excellent, it's time for you to leave, you're out of there. Really, that was actually one of the accepted options at the time, was a legitimate reason for a divorce in that kind of school of Hillel, was you found somebody else more attractive. That's pretty modern, really, isn't it, for 2,000 years ago, just like not modern in a good way. Now, that latter super liberal view was becoming the norm in society, as we might expect. But still, people might be wondering, well, where does Jesus stand on this thing? Which side is he going to take? And you can see if those Pharisees had even an inkling that Jesus might be on this stricter side of the spectrum, well, they might want to get him to put his cards on the table, to say it in public, and to put a dent in his crowd appeal. So how does Jesus answer? Well, as he often does, Jesus answers by going back to the Bible, by referring to what God has said. Haven't you read, he starts with, haven't you read? And that's a bit of an insult, really, for those Pharisees, because they prided themselves on knowing all of these words back to front, inside out, and upside down. And of course they have read the bits Jesus is quoting. Jesus quotes bits from the very, very beginning of the Bible that are going to be super easy for them to find, probably read it thousands of times. So of course they have read. Haven't you read this? Yes, they have read this. What is Jesus' point as he's quoting from those beginning bits of the Bible? Well, God's design for marriage is to be a connection between one man and one woman. He references back to Genesis 1:27, that first book in the Bible, male and female, he created them. And then marriage is to be something exclusive and unbreakable. Again, he references back to that very first book in the Bible, Genesis chapter 2:24. A man leaves his father and mother, he's united to his wife, they become one flesh. Now, marriage is designed as a permanent uniting. You leave your father and mother and you're united to your wife. It's even a closer unity than the parent-child biological relationship. It's meant to be an amazing level of connection. And it's a connection that's not meant to be undone by humans. And the reason it's not meant to be undone by humans is because fundamentally it's not done by humans in the first place. God is the one doing the uniting in marriage, not us. Did you notice that? What God has joined together, what God has done, let people not separate. It's God's design. God has united them. Now, when he says, let no one separate there, well, the English language carries a present, an ongoing sense to it. It's like Jesus is saying, you people keep on separating. You keep on separating things God has joined together, and you need to stop it. And we might think that the finger is pointing principally at those who are involved in these divorces. But Jesus is perhaps more focused on the ones who are teaching that there's no issue with this. The ones teaching that it was just fine, like that Hillel guy. Hey, don't worry, you can divorce for any and every reason. That act of teaching is what was tearing marriages apart. And I guess similarly today, those who tell you you must follow your heart or you need to be true to yourself might be in a danger of doing a similar thing. We're going to go quite fast. We'll cover a lot of ground today. What do we see here? We see, if we are to put it politically, that Jesus is the continuity candidate. He's the continuity candidate. Where does Jesus stand on this issue? Exactly where God has always stood on the issue right from the beginning. He draws a straight line from the very first chapters of the Bible right to his day. He says exactly the same thing. We're not going anywhere. That's what he underlines by going back to the first pages. Jesus is not pitching novel, new ideas about marriage. He's not revealing an updated policy. We're introducing this year version 2 marriage, which has some different things. He's the continuity candidate. The basic design for marriage is and has always been male, female, exclusive, unbreakable. And obviously that is not the answer the disciples were hoping for. Like, look at the way they respond. If this is the situation, it's better not to marry. You can see their heads are in their hands. And the Pharisees, they are probably rubbing their hands together in glee, thinking the more Jesus says, the more he's blowing it, the more he is turning people off and walking away from the popular position he had. No one's ever going to follow somebody with such an old-fashioned idea as that. Now, we've got to be honest, that's not the answer people in Jesus' day were hoping for. Maybe it's not the answer that you were hoping for either. Right? We should be honest about this. This is not an attractive position to hold in a modern Western world. If you're looking for views everyone's going to approve of, Jesus just isn't your guy. Following him just isn't going to win you very many likes. And to make things even more difficult, we have to recognize Jesus does not do pick and mix. You know, you can take some teachings of Jesus you like, love your neighbor, I like that one, we'll have that, thanks Jesus. And you can take other teachings of Jesus that you don't like, marriage is exclusive, unbreakable, don't like that one, no thanks Jesus. It doesn't work like that. It's all or nothing with Jesus. If you're hearing what Jesus is saying here, and you're thinking, no thanks, talk to the hand, that one is not for me, Jesus, I need you to understand you are saying no to Jesus as Lord when you do that. You're saying no to him as the one who gets to be the boss, the one who's in charge, the one who makes the rules. And a no to him as Lord, it's really important we're clear, is a no to him as Savior too. See, Jesus can only be both Lord and Savior. You can't take one or the other. You can only have both. There's no halfway house. You can only have him as Lord and Savior, or you will meet him as your judge on the last day. No third way. Now, it's a hard thing to say. I don't want to say things like this. But I'm just the messenger. If you don't like what Jesus has to say, take it up with Jesus. But as I've been thinking about this week, it might be helpful to look into why perhaps the Lord has ordered things this way. You know, has he done this just to be difficult, just to make life hard for us? Just to make following Jesus something unpopular if you ever own up to what he teaches? Well, if we go all the way back, marriage came into the world in response to the one thing that was not good in creation. It was not good, the Bible tells us, for man to be alone in the beginning. That aloneness couldn't be addressed by any of the other creatures God has made, no matter how snuggly or cuddly they might be, not good enough. It needed somebody like Adam, somebody suitable. Now, as we're getting into this, I have to say from the beginning, the final and full solution to it being not good to be alone, it's not that everyone should get married. That's not the right solution. It is that everyone needs to be in a relationship with God. That's the right end solution. Marriage is not the right or best destination for each person, and we will come on to that later in the passage. I know there's just a ton in here today. In fact, the Bible tells us strangely that marriage does not continue on into heaven. Yet everything is going to be good. In fact, everything's going to be better than good. Everything's going to be perfect, and there won't be marriage. Now, for many of us who are married, that's a hard thing to get your head around, how that ending could be good. But it will be. And that not goodness of being alone is going to be replaced by the goodness of being with God and with his people forever. So that's the destination. Marriage is designed for our good as a step on the way there. But marriage is also a reflection of God's own character. See, the Bible tells us that marriage pictures the relationship between Jesus and his church. And how does Ephesians chapter 5, if you want to read some more about that, that's where it's expressed most clearly. This is what it's about. How does that relationship look between Jesus and his church? Well, it's exclusive and it's unbreakable. Jesus is never unfaithful to his church. His church must not be unfaithful to him. Jesus will never forsake his church, and his church must not forsake him. And that's why adultery is outside of God's design at bottom, because it distorts this picture of how Jesus relates to his church. It undermines the exclusivity of the relationship. That's why divorce is outside of God's design, because it undermines the unbreakability of his commitment to us. Breaking God's design undermines what marriage is meant to picture. But that's not all the harm it does. I'm sure many of us know breaking God's design never results in our good. His design flows out of his character, his goodness, out of his love, out of his care for us. His design isn't just right, it is best. Like sometimes it's hard for us to believe that or see how that could be best, but that's what we trust. There's always harm when we break the design. Now, that's our foundation that we're going to build up from. We've got more to say. But marriage is good where alone is not. Marriage is not the final solution or the only option. But it is meant to be exclusive, and it is meant to be unbreakable, like the relationship between Jesus and the church that marriage pictures. It's for our good, and when we distort its design, we reap harm. But there's quite a bit more in the passage we read today. See, Jesus is quite happy to stand against culture when culture is wrong, when culture stands against God. But the Pharisees have got another card up their sleeves they're going to pull out here, a way they think they can make Jesus even less popular. Not only is he choosing an unpopular strategy on divorce, but they think they can hear in his opening statement something that shows he's not just standing against culture, but standing against Moses, this most revered teacher in all of the Jewish histories. Say the Pharisees, so I see you are saying that marriage is unbreakable. Well, that's interesting, but I raise you the teachings of Moses, the man who brought us God's law. They think they've gotten. Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide there, aren't they? There you go. That's our foundation. Now, there we go. Why then, they asked, did Moses command a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? They think they've gotten. Jesus cannot be a true teacher from God because he contradicts Moses. Well, their confidence can be very short-lived. So first up, Jesus sets the record straight. Notice how Jesus clarifies the language. Why did Moses command? Well, Jesus replied, Moses permitted. Moses commanded divorce, says Jesus. Really? No, Moses permitted it, and that's quite a different thing. The Pharisees and Jesus are drawing, of course, on the same teachings of Moses. Here they are way back in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24. The original language here is a bit tricky, and I'm trying to kind of lay out some of the conditionality in there. But the focus is really on remarriage. That foundational text they're using is not really focused on divorce. But Jesus is right as he reads it. Moses is regulating something that was happening rather than commanding it. He's saying, if there should be a divorce for this reason, and if these things should happen, and if that should happen, then this is okay, and that is not. So Jesus explains that Moses only permitted divorce, but he doesn't stop there. He goes on and lays out for them the real permission in what Moses has said, and then he puts his finger on the real problem that is driving this, and then he shows them the root that's behind it. So let's do those in turn. What's the real permission? In some limited circumstances, the least harmful thing to do is to separate what God has joined together, to separate what no one should separate. No one should separate it, but because our hearts are hard and our world is broken, then sometimes that is a permissible path. Sometimes that's the least harmful way ahead. And then he goes on to clarify that it's only in exceptional situations that divorce and any subsequent remarriage is legitimate. In our whole New Testaments, the kind of the part of the Bible that follows the time of Jesus, there are only 2 passages that set out legitimate exceptions to the unbreakability of marriage. This one, and there's another letter written by the Apostle Paul called 1 Corinthians in chapter 7. If you look at both these settings where these exceptional circumstances are discussed, it's no surprise that before them you get an extensive recap of this is God's design. It starts with this is God's primary design. Marriage is unbreakable and exclusive. You get an emphasis on that, and then you get, but there are some exceptional moments. But that's the main path. That's the primary plan. Then Jesus explains, well, why does Moses give this permission to break what shouldn't be broken? What's the real problem? Well, it is because your hearts were hard. And one of the things you might not notice here is how Jesus moves the language. So the Pharisees are asking a man in the abstract, a woman in the abstract, what's going on over there? And Jesus says, you, your wives, your hearts. He's turning it to point directly at them. And why? Because their own hardness of heart is what's behind this. That's where the idea of separating for any and every reason comes from. It comes from our hard-heartedness, that we won't choose love. We won't offer forgiveness. We won't serve others. We won't die to our own desires and our own wants. The real problem is our hard hearts. But Jesus does agree with what he can agree with. There is a permission to separate there and present. And then he finally hints at the real root at the problem. It was not this way from the beginning. Now, Jesus is not undermining Moses, saying he's a bit of a V2, you know. We started out okay, and then Moses put an extra layer on top. Not a recent innovation. Remember, Jesus has commented already on the ongoing validity of every single detail of this Mosaic law. Back in chapter 5, Jesus rejects the traditions of the elders when they conflict with and are placed over God's law, but he absolutely holds that law tightly himself. What Jesus is doing here is he's pointing out this permission to separate flows out the problem of our hard hearts, and it's not rooted in God's good creation right at the beginning. Just as it's not reflected in God's good design right at the beginning. Did you notice when we spoke about the design for marriage from Genesis chapters 1 and 2, that comes before the great crisis in the history of humanity in Genesis chapter 3. It flows out of humanity's what we call the fall, where our first parents, Adam and Eve, said a no to God's way, tried to grasp what belongs only to God, broke their relationship with him, broke their relationship with each other, broke our world in a way that is so fundamental, it leaves each one of us broken. That's the true root of this permission to separate. The permission to break God's good design. Well, our fallen world breeds and feeds hard hearts that break God's design. There's nothing that's not tarnished by that. Just want to notice here that Jesus doesn't say that marriage must be broken in those circumstances, or even that it should be broken. That would be the better and righter thing to do. He says it could be broken. It's just permissible. If the design for exclusivity in marriage has already been broken, the design for fidelity already distorted, then it is permissible that the unbreakable be broken. And I know we're getting a bit complicated here, but we need to do this together in a bunch. Jesus only mentions this one exception, this one place where it would be right to break God's good design. The Apostle Paul adds a second in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, I already mentioned. Speaking about marriages where one person becomes a believer, he encourages the believer, stay, hold on to that marriage, pursue. But he accepts the other party might choose to leave and choose divorce, and what's unbreakable has been broken. Now, one way of reading this is, Jesus got one idea, Paul's got another, the Bible's at war with itself. That is not a helpful way to read this. Here's a better way to read this. What we have here is what we would call casuistic law. Casuistic law, big words. What it is examples, cases with judgments intended to illustrate a more general pattern, intended to lead wisdom. And this is often how teaching in the Bible works, rather than getting exhaustive lists. So here's a good example for you. If anyone uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the one who opened the pit must pay the owner for the loss and take the dead animal in exchange. Now, what if your horse falls into the pit? Bad luck you, nothing for you, no responsibility, it's fine? No, of course not. That's silly. It's just an example. It's just an illustrative example to establish the more general pattern. That's how we as a church understand Jesus and Paul to be teaching on marriage and divorce. We've got the general principle. We've got God's good design. Marriage is exclusive, unbreakable. We've got 2 illustrative examples in our New Testament. That's not very many, but it's enough to show us that sometimes divorce is acceptable. Sometimes it's an appropriate path. Real life is messy. It's complicated. It's painful. Everyone's situation is unique. When it comes to marriage and divorce, it is difficult to know what is right in many cases. We can't just draw up a short list of rules and enforce hard, clear rules. It doesn't work like that. But if you want to read more about how we think about this, how we approach this as a church, we would love you to do that. You can find our policy posted publicly through the church app, and that kind of sets out how we think about it. If you want to talk to somebody about what we think or talk about your situation, just to speak about it, not to get anyone to jump on you or anything like that, do please come to any of the elders, the leaders here, and we'd be happy to do that. But it's important that I say this is one of the matters where even Christians trying to do what the Bible teaches carefully come to different conclusions on what we should do. You don't have to agree with us on the way we've understood this as a church to be here, to gather with us. We're glad to have you here. We do ask you, disagree gently, disagree gracefully, because people who've been up close to these things, they're often really hurt. They often find it extremely painful to talk about. So if you have to talk about it gently and gracefully. Now, I know I've said a lot already, but that wasn't the end of our passage. You might have noticed it wasn't the end of our passage. We've got to go a bit further and dig a bit more before we're done. We didn't read those 3 sections together by accident. We read them together deliberately because we think they go together. We've talked a lot about marriage. It's relevant to some of us. What about everybody else? Well, perhaps you're feeling rather smug, like you got off easy. The disciples definitely seem to think so. What do they think? If that's the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry. Now, I read that and I was thinking, what are the disciples meaning here? Particularly since Jesus just set out, marriage is actually God's good design. It's the right place to be. It's a good place to be. How could it be better not to marry? We learn later on in the Bible, some of these disciples who are chatting to Jesus are in fact married. Are the married ones kind of regretting getting into their marriages? Now they've realized, oh no, it's going to be really hard to get out of this marriage if I decide I don't like her or find someone else hotter. Oh, it's really disappointing. I wish I hadn't done it. I don't think so. Perhaps, I wonder, this might be more like knowing so many marriages struggled in their day as they do in our day, seeing so many marriages broken in their day as there are in our day, whether it's legitimate or illegitimate, the disciples are suggesting, well, maybe it's better not to try in the first place. I'm sure like us, they all knew the pain. They all knew the damage and the hurt that can come out of marriages, broken, or even many of those that are not. If you forgive the Chariots of Fire quote, perhaps their basic idea is, if I can't win, I won't run. If we can't get this marriage thing to work perfectly, we better not start at all. That, I think, helps us make sense of Jesus' next teaching, right? Because I think he is cautioning against running all the way to thinking marriage is so hard, so difficult to break, it is better to be single. And I think what he says to us next just shows us single is hard too. He starts talking about eunuchs all of a sudden, that is boys with the boy bits cut off. He starts talking about eunuchs, I think because single and ready to mingle was not really a category in Jesus' day, at least not for guys over 18. Society expects you to marry, expects you to reproduce, expects you to do so quickly, thank you very much. In Judaism, marriage was not only praised, it was basically required, and singleness was something to be avoided. Here's one of the guys doing background research that I read about this, talking about what it was like in that era. Now, eunuchs were the exception. They wouldn't marry because they couldn't marry and reproduce. They were despised in Jewish culture because they couldn't fulfill God's command to be fruitful and multiply, that is, to have children. They were excluded from the temple and the worship of God. So When you read eunuch, I think we're actually right to think single as well. But look at what Jesus has to say about them. Derided by their culture, Jesus dignifies them through his words. There's a valid kingdom life as a single. That would have been a radical thing to say. This could be a right way to live. And think about this. Who is single? Jesus. John the Baptist, his forerunner. The Apostle Paul, one of the key leaders in the church. There's a radical departure from the normal kind of pattern at the time. This new kingdom Jesus is bringing definitely has honor and places value on single people as well as on married people. He gives us 3 different categories: those born that way, those made that way by people, those choosing that way for the sake of the kingdom. I think those are helpful as we think about singleness too. So sometimes we're simply made in a way that will keep us single. Not our choice, but our reality. Seemingly flowing out of God's making of us, the way he's made us. Something we just have to accept. And sometimes it's others around us who have made us this way, meaning singleness is the right path for us. Now, in Jesus' situation he's talking about, it's the only possible path because they're physically limited. But I think we can see how wounds from others, which aren't just physical, might have the same effect as well. They might make a single life the right choice for us. And then he introduces one more category: people choosing singleness for the sake of the kingdom. Someone can choose a single life for the sake of the kingdom. That can be a good thing and a right thing. That's massively countercultural in Jesus' day to suggest there's a meaningful and valued path outside of marriage. The Apostle Paul go on to reinforce the same thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 again. It's important we see, though, that this is a single life for the sake of the kingdom that's in view, not a single life just so I'm free to please myself. Don't have the bother of needing to worry about somebody else and what they want to do. I can just do my own stuff. Like an analog might be people choosing childlessness today just so they've got more time and money to travel the world for themselves. Okay, but here's the question. Are the disciples right? Is it better to not marry? What's Jesus saying about singleness? Well, what he says is not everyone can accept this word. I think he's pointing to the disciples and they're wondering whether it's better not to marry. I think he's showing us singleness is hard as well. Not everyone can manage that without stumbling. Although there are advantages, opportunities in singleness, there are challenges too. Jesus tells us plainly that is not his plan or his path for everyone. See, not everyone can accept this. Isn't Jesus saying not everyone is willing to accept this? It's not a question of the will. It's not everyone is capable or has the capacity to accept this. Not everyone is capable of holding or containing. It's a really important distinction. This is something some people are given, which implies other people are not given it. It's a challenge we should all aspire to? No. A higher level everyone should strive for? No. But God gives some people the capability and capacity for it. He wraps the teaching both ends with that same wording. The one who can accept this should accept it. Again, the same sense, not willingness. No, I don't accept that, Jesus. But capacity or capability. The one who can handle it should handle it. If this is what you're given, if this is what you are by nature, if this is what you are by other wounds, by a special gift from God, yeah, you should do this. But if that's not you, is it better not to marry? Given marriage is a risk, given hurt and brokenness are both real possibilities in marriage, well, Jesus actually doesn't answer. I think he acknowledges there's truth in the disciples' words. Marriage is hard and dangerous. I think he knows and sees that singleness is hard and dangerous too. And remember, it wasn't this way from the beginning. This all flows out of the sad truth that our hearts are hard. That's where the wounds, the hurts, that's where the dangers and the troubles come from. Our hearts are hard. So what are we meant to do with all this? I was thinking about how do you apply a text like this? Well, it might have seemed odd to include those last few verses about children and blessing and kingdom. But did you notice it happens right there and then? It's got this little connective, then people brought. It's like it happens right away. It's like it rolls into one scene. It's an immediate thing, and it's not an accident. Here's how I think this connects. We talked about who children were in that culture before, how that society thought of them. They are utterly insignificant, not like the center of the universe like they are today. They're insignificant. The main value they have in that society is looking after you when you're old, which would be quite nice. They're no importance except as your pension. They're worthy of no attention. Well, how does that connect to what we're talking about? As we think about marriage and singleness, maybe you think you have no issues. Maybe you think you're doing fine. It's other people who have problems. Oh no, marriage is hard. There's no escape in singleness either. At its root, we've said this lots of times before, but the problem isn't primarily out there in other people and their bad things. The primary problem is in here, with us, with our hard hearts. All this talk of broken marriages, difficult singleness, what should it leave us? It should leave us humbled. Whatever our lot. Maybe you're winning today. Will you always win? Maybe you're finding it easy today. Will you find it always easy? Maybe you know you've failed. Maybe you know you have not got it right. We should humble ourselves. And then once we're humbled, perhaps we can rightly hear Jesus' words about those little children also extended to us. He says, the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these unimportant, insignificant, humble little failures. It's not a kingdom of winners. It's not a kingdom of top performers. God's kingdom is one of losers and failures. A kingdom whose foundation is mercy and grace. Now, if you know that you belong in that category, that you need those things, this can be your kingdom too through Jesus. I'd love you to go back and read your way through Matthew 18 today. The context for what happens in Matthew 19. What's the setting? Well, let's work our way backwards. Last week, we saw our God is the great King who hears our plea, forgives our unpayable debt, and calls us to forgive like him. 2 weeks ago, we saw God's design for his kingdom. It's all about reconciliation, restoration. It's all about pursuing people and bringing them back. The week before, we saw our God is the good shepherd who leaves the 99 to go after the one who has wandered off, the one who will bring that one back rejoicing. And then one more week back at the start of chapter 18, we saw Jesus centering the little children, the same little children as here. The whole thing's bracketed by them. Unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of God. Is how it started. The kingdom of heaven belongs to such of these, is how it finishes. What should all this talk of marriage and divorce and singleness do for us? It should show us our hearts are hard. It should invite us all to humble ourselves like little children. You might worry that God would send you away if you come like that, but Jesus invites you to come to be blessed. Humble yourselves under God's mighty hand, and he will lift you up. It's only Jesus that can transform those hard hearts. It's the only way out. So what we're going to do now is we're going to sing together with the help of our wonderful musicians. Again, if I can invite you guys to come and join us. We're going to use this song as a way to respond together, and it's a call to our hearts to think about who our God is. It tells us wonderful truths. Our God is one who restores all that is broken. Our God is one who gives life and brings hope. So, let's sing.
Can we stand together?
You give life, you are hope, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. You give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, we pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only.
And all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. And all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Please be seated.
Thank you, musicians. Our God is great. We serve an awesome God. We love to interact with one another at Hope City, so why not turn to... We should be going straight to K&R right now because we've got quite a lot of questions. So Matt will be joining me right away. I'll be looking at the questions. And...
asking questions. You're welcome to keep asking questions as we chat, but I thought we would just bop in right away.
So let's get our phones out. It's on the screen, actually, so...
And you can vote questions up to the top if there's something you want us to get to. Probably won't be able to hit them all today.
So let's go straight to it. Thank you for tackling this difficult subject with grace, Matt.
Well, I'm glad I didn't crack up completely. It's hard and sad, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, good effort. Another one. When it says that adultery is a permissible reason for divorce, is this literal? Or do we take Jesus' words saying, if you even look at another lustfully?
This is because in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus talks about, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I say to you, if you even so much as look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. I actually asked myself the same question as I was preparing. And in general, the word Jesus uses for sexual immorality here is specifically a physical act. It's a slightly different word, so it probably doesn't refer to thoughts and attitudes of the heart, but to a physical act that has broken the relationship in this case. If it was the life of the mind, we would have no marriages standing in the room. So I think we probably want to understand it that way, but it's difficult.
Okay, another is here, quite a lot. My sister is married to a guy that's pulling my sister away from Jesus. I wish divorce for her. But how should I pray about this in light of this passage?
Yeah. Do you ever want to pray that what God wants to be unbroken is broken? Doesn't it feel like you're praying against the will of God? Maybe the better prayer is for a transforming work of God on the other party. And if you look in 1 Corinthians 7, that's definitely the attitude that Paul takes there. So Paul says, who knows, you might be the one through whom the other person is saved. You might be the channel of grace to them. So I don't know the detail, don't know quite how to speak about it, but I would suggest the way to pray about it is to pray for your sister, that she might be filled with the transforming power of Jesus and that she might be such a light that she might win over her husband. Pray for the husband that his heart might be softened by a good God who wants marriages restored, not broken, who wants marriages upheld, not to fail. So I think that's probably how I want to pray. There we go.
Okay, let's just do one more, or two more. By God's grace, we've been married for over 20 years.
Well done.
Which I take for granted too easily. What are the most important things to do to maintain a marriage?
Well, we recently clocked 25, which I'm also extremely thankful for, and I agree it is easy to take this for granted all too easily. How much do I know about this? Not that much. What I think is perhaps most important in marriage is communication. So I think especially when life is busy, especially when each party has their own interests and you've got demands upon you perhaps from older generations and younger generations, perhaps you've got so many things on your plate, I think probably the most important thing to do is to try and make time to stay genuinely connected and in communication. We had many years where we were able to organize what we called a date night, where we went out just as a couple and talked to one another. That was a great blessing, but it's not always possible. We had many years where we went away together as a couple for a day or a few days just to talk about who we are and how things are going and where we want to be. It's been enormously fruitful for us. But I think all of those kind of come back to communication. What do you think, Bimbo? What would you say?
Oh, it's tough. We're 21 years in marriage already too, and effective communication helps. Don't take your partner for granted.
Yeah.
Always be there for each other. It helps. And most of all, prayer changes things. And let me just merge these two as we wrap this. Not a Q&R, but I think this talk was really good. We should encourage single people to understand more about divorce and marriage, and not only couples. And how about a marriage seminar of some sort? We need it.
Wow. Well, Tom is here, our Director of Learning and Training. So I'll say, Tom, over to you. It'd be great to have a longer form setting to talk about this in more detail and to explore. And if you felt like a lot of that wasn't relevant to you today, maybe you're not married, not thinking about marriage just now, I guess I had a paragraph in, but I was just trying to cut so much. This was like an hour and 20 minutes on Saturday morning, so you should be thankful we managed to get that down somewhat. 60% of marriages in the UK just now are expected to end in divorce. 60%. So even if you are not a direct participant in that, you will doubtless be around people who are struggling in their marriage and whose marriages will come to divorce. And for you to understand that and to be able to engage with that thoughtfully and gracefully, I think is a useful thing. So I do think it is worth all of us kind of being clued up on this.
It can be exhausted. It can't. So that's all we have time for, sadly. So Matt, the big idea today.
I wrote this down in case I got a bit stressed out. Our hard hearts break God's good design, but there's grace for the humble.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.